Last year, the state of New York passed a law aimed at restricting certain kinds of online speech. The satirical website, the Babylon Bee, is challenging the ruling that could criminalise satire. Hateful conduct is defined by the statute to include online speech that can vilify or humiliate a group or a class on the basis of race, sex and other traits. So, to discuss this, I'm joined by Seth Dillon, the CEO of the Babylon Bee, one of the networks challenging the law, and ADF lawyer Jeremy Tedesco. Thanks both for joining me. Seth, I want to come to you first, because the Babylon Bee has been in quite a lot of trouble over the years. I know before Elon Musk took over Twitter, you were actually kicked off almost entirely. So you are particularly vulnerable to this kind of law, aren't you?
Well, yeah, and I think it's because we make jokes about the popular narrative like a comedian is supposed to. And there's people in positions of power that want to protect the narrative from being joked about. So I think a lot of these policies, misinformation policies, hateful conduct policies, are aimed at basically putting up guardrails on what you're allowed to talk about, what kind of beliefs you're allowed to express, and even what kind of jokes you're allowed to make. Yeah, we had this experience with Twitter last year where we made a joke about Admiral Rachel Levine, who's a transgender health admiral in the Biden administration. We named Rachel Levine our pick for Man of the Year, jokingly, in response to USA Today naming Rachel Levine Woman of the Year. And that got us locked in Twitter jail. We were in Twitter jail for 8 months until Elon busted us out of there. So we made a joke we weren't supposed to make. We misgendered someone, and this was considered hateful.
So that's really interesting. A lot of people think that when it comes to the sort of social justice activists, that they just don't have a sense of humour and they do tend to take everything literally. But from what you're saying, that it might be the case that they know that these things are satirical, they know that they're jokes, but they want to use these kinds of legislation to basically have a go at you and stop you because they don't like the fact that you're mocking them.
Oh, absolutely. 100%. I used to think it was just humorless scolds, people who had no sense of humor and didn't think our jokes were funny or were just ultra sensitive and actually offended by them. But I don't think that's the case. I think it's primarily fake outrage. They realize that if they pretend to be outraged enough at your speech, they can put these restrictions in place where they can actually outlaw your speech and make it even objectively true statements can become enforceable policy violations. And that's how they control your speech and they protect their own ideas from being challenged.
Jeremy Tedesco, can I bring you in here from a legal perspective? This is a relatively new law. Did they not think to carve out some exceptions for satire and stand-up comedy and that kind of thing?
Yeah, there's really no exceptions that could save this law. I mean, what the state's doing here that's so problematic is the state can't censor in this way directly. But what they're trying to do here is co-opt private companies and then third-party users on these platforms as the censors themselves to basically do what the government can't do directly through these private parties. So this is a particularly egregious attempt to try to basically co-opt people in the private sector to do censorship at the bidding of the state, pursuant to a policy, this hateful conduct policy, that clearly doesn't, stand up under free speech standards in the U.S. And so New York knows they couldn't do this directly, and they're asking these third parties to do it for them. So it's like a double whammy on free speech violations, and it can't stand.
Yeah, because we have a similar thing. We just passed the online safety bill here in the UK, which effectively outsources those kinds of decisions to big tech and unelected regulators. But I would have expected in America, with your First Amendment, this isn't going to happen. But clearly there is a problem. Seth Dillon, is there a growing mistrust of free speech, do you think, in America?
I think so, because what we have prevailing right now, like we talk about wokeness, we talk about these woke worldviews. These are worldviews that can't be rationally defended or coherently articulated. They have to be insulated from criticism, especially the most effective kind of criticism, which is mockery that exposes foolishness for what it is. And so in order to insulate worldviews that you can't defend from criticism, you have to put all kinds of rules in place about what can and can't be said. So yeah, speech is being chilled, and it's being chilled for a reason.
Do you think that it's been a good thing that Elon Musk has taken over Twitter and has sort of brought a lot of satirical accounts back? Or do you think that's going to last? I mean, we can't really have a situation where whatever multi-billionaire is around sort of decides on the parameters of what comedy is acceptable and what isn't.
No, I don't. I appreciate Musk stepping in. I say this all the time. I don't think that we should be dependent on benevolent billionaires to speak freely. You know, it shouldn't be up to them to be making decisions about where we can speak and whether we can speak. That should be protected by the law. And so, I think free speech in the public square is really threatened when the public square has moved online, and we need to figure out exactly how our First Amendment is going to be protected in places where most of the vast majority of public discourse is taking place.
And you're challenging this at the moment. Jeremy Tedesco, could you tell us a bit more about the challenge and how you're approaching this?
Well, the Bee has actually filed what's called a friend of the court brief. So they're not a party in the case. They're a third party who's telling the court, look, we think our rights are implicated by this case that's ongoing, and we want to tell the court how we think it should rule in light of the fact that we have interests here, too. The case is actually brought by a First Amendment professor here in the States named Eugene Volokh and the platform Rumble and Locals. And so right now it's on appeal at the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. And that's just one step below the U.S. Supreme Court. So, this case may make it all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, might get sent all the way back down to the lower court. We'll have to see. But one thing I want to make sure your listeners understand, and I know you all know this very well, is that this problem of censorship isn't happening just on tech platforms. It's happening in the banking and financial industries as well. The same kind of policies, these hateful conduct policies that tech platforms and now New York is trying to use to censor speech online, banks are using to censor people from being able to have access to their bank accounts or to payment processing. So this is a corporate problem that we have to solve. When private companies start censoring speech, it has the same, if not more chilling effect on people's willingness to engage in those protected freedoms than when the government's doing it. And so we need to stop these companies from doing it. We certainly need to stop states from New York co-opting these private companies from engaging in this kind of censorship.
And of course, Seth Dillon, isn't the risk here that if you have something as nebulous as hateful speech or hateful conduct, then anyone can sort of decide what hate means depending on their particular political preferences?
Well, it ends up being whoever is holding the powers, the levers of power at the particular moment, whatever's offensive to them, whatever they're sensitive to. Of course, they're going to rule that that's hate speech. I mean, if you just simply say that this is a marginalized group, they're a protected group, you can't joke about them, then all speech about that group is now outlawed and it's not allowed. And this is one of the things that's the most insane thing about the whole conversation to me, is that the idea that the people that we've made jokes about that have landed us in hot water are marginalized and oppressed, because they're not. These are actually the most privileged people in our culture who have all of the powers that be behind them and backing them. And so they have tremendous privilege and power. They say that we're punching down when we make these jokes. We're actually punching up, because we're making jokes about the prevailing powers that be and poking holes in the popular narrative.
But of course, as you say, they will say that they are the marginalised, even though, of course, a lot of these activists can effectively get people fired, turfed out of their jobs just on a whim. So it doesn't seem that marginalised to me. Jeremy Tedesco, can I just ask you about this, though? Isn't the First Amendment, just speaking as an outsider, but isn't the First Amendment secure enough to mean that eventually, when this goes right up to the top, to the Supreme Court, it will always be shut down? That really, in America, it's not really possible to have a law that effectively limits free speech?
Well, I would say there's activists on the other side, in government and otherwise, who are constantly trying to chip away at what you rightly point out is a very strong First Amendment free speech standard. And, we have to be vigilant to protect against those things. And I do think that if a case like this goes to the U.S. Supreme Court, that we'd get the right ruling. But what I think is really important to understand about the day and age we live in right now is that there are activists they are intentionally trying to bypass our First Amendment rights, free speech rights, by going to the private companies, just like New York is doing here, and getting them to censor. And so we have this huge problem of private censorship in this country, whether you want to say it's, caused by activists trying to co-opt those companies, or they're just willing to do it themselves. It's still an enormous problem. And people are afraid, are increasingly afraid to express their views online. And they're afraid about losing their bank accounts or their social media accounts simply because people might disagree with them at these companies. That's not a healthy free speech culture, and we need one.
And Seth Dillon, so, I mean, the Babylon Bee, it's absolutely hilarious. It's a brilliant site. And, of course, you depend on social media and the internet for your whole operation. So what would you say? I mean, what if this law were to be sustained and satire were to be curtailed? What do you do at that point? Do you modify your material accordingly? What would your answer be?
A lot of that, my writers have told me that they have actually faced situations where they thought about making a joke and held back because they didn't want to violate one of these policies. And so they've actually engaged in some level of self-censorship. I encourage them not to do that. I encourage them to speak freely. If we did end up violating this law, and that we had some kind of repercussion for it, or there's penalties basically the penalty that would be imposed on us is that our content would be taken down. We could potentially be deplatformed as a result of this. We would go way beyond just filing a brief and actually file a lawsuit at that case, I would imagine.
But you've had this before, haven't you? Because when the tweet you mentioned earlier, you were told that you must delete the tweet and admit that it was hateful. Is that right? Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah, we had to check a box saying that we admitted that we violated the terms, including the hateful conduct policy, and we refused to check that box and delete the tweet. We were willing to be off Twitter permanently. We had no idea that Elon was going to come in and buy Twitter and restore our account. So yeah, it was that important to us that we take a stand there and say, look, we are not going to censor ourselves. You don't have the right to shut us up. We have every right to make this joke. There was no hate to this joke. In fact, it's the truth, and the truth is not hate speech. So we stood very firm on that.
So is that the answer? Just creative people have to they have to self-censor less, be a bit tougher, and just carry on expressing themselves as they see fit?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that people will become emboldened by that approach. The more people that do that, see, the more people that censor themselves, the more power they give these tyrants. You're doing the tyrant's work for him. And then what ends up happening is fewer and fewer people will be bold enough to speak out because censorship is the prevailing thing. But if enough people do speak out and they actually continue to say the things they're not supposed to say, more and more people, I think, will be emboldened to do that. And that's the way to push back, is to speak freely.
Well, Seth Dillon and Jeremy Tedesco, thanks ever so much for joining me today.